Okay, good afternoon, everyone. It is great to see you all here in this room at the Urban Institute, and also welcome to the people who are joining virtually. I want to thank you for joining us in this conversation with Matt Desmond, How We Can End Poverty in America. My name is Mary Cunningham. I am the Vice President of the Metropolitan Housing Community Center here at Urban. I'm gonna actually start us off with some housekeeping notes. We are broadcasting and recording this event. The recording, slides, and additional content will be shared after the event. For those who are watching virtually, we've enabled live captions, and that can be turned on by clicking the CC button on the bottom right corner of your media player. We want to engage with the audience both online and in person. So to ask questions as a virtual attendee, please put your question in the Q&A box at any time. For those of you who are attending in person, you can access the event dashboard and QR codes right in the middle of your table there. Please contact events@urban.org if you need technical assistance. If you would like to join the conversation on Twitter, please use the hashtag #live@urban. If you would like your book signed, I see many of you have books today. There's also going to be books for sale out in the lobby. If you would like your book signed after the conversation, please use the markers and sticky notes that are available on your table to write your name and just place it on the top of the book. This will help us have an efficient moving line and to make sure that everyone who has their book or wants their book signed is able to do so. So lastly, we would love your feedback. Afterwards, we'll be emailing a link to the post-event survey, and we ask that you share your feedback with us. It's helpful for us to hear what you're thinking about, and it definitely helps us shape what we're doing in the future. Okay, those are the housekeeping notes, so let's get to the good part. I'm going to start by introducing our guest today. Matthew Desmond is the Maurice P. During Professor of Sociology at Princeton University and is the founding director of the Eviction Lab. His last book, Evicted, Poverty and Profit in the American City, won the Pulitzer Prize, among many other awards. He's the recipient of the MacArthur Fellowship and a contributing writer for the New York Times Magazine. More than a long list of awards, which are really quite impressive. Matt has changed the way we think and talk about poverty and housing insecurity in America. He and his team at the Eviction Lab have built a data set on eviction filings across the country that has been used to both understand the problem and challenge and to start a conversation about solutions. These data were critical to informing the policy response and keeping people housed during the pandemic. Through his beautiful writing, he shared stories of struggle, humanity, and the hope of people surviving the deepest poverty and deprivation, and he's created an emotional and moral connection for all of us. He reminds us that this work is about people, not just data and statistics. There's going to be two parts to the conversation today. Matt and I are going to start off by discussing his new book, Poverty by America, and then I'm going to invite my colleague Myra Jones-Taylor for the second half of the conversation, which will focus on the role of evidence and storytelling in fighting poverty and how we can have a greater impact as scholars, researchers, and policy wonks. So without further ado, I want to welcome Matt Desmond to the stage.
I get this side?
Yes.
All right, it's my better side, I think. Hey, everybody. Thanks for having me.
I'm going to juggle paper and iPad because I'm not confident enough in just the iPad.
You got this.
Yes. So let's start off by talking about your new book. It's a very different book from Evicted. And I want to hear from you, and I'm sure the audience wants to hear why you decided to write this book.
You know, when I lived in Milwaukee writing Evicted, I met, you know, grandmas living without heat in the winter. I saw kids evicted in a routine basis. I remember being on an eviction once, and we showed up to this house. It was like this rainy spring day, and we went in, and there was just kids living in the house. And the mom had died, and the kids had just gone on living. And they evicted the kids, and they put all their stuff out on the curb, and someone called social services, and the landlord changes the locks, and we were off to the next eviction. And I think, you know, seeing those kind of things really drove this question of, like, why inside of me? Why? And I felt convicted. I had studied poverty all my adult life. I had taught classes at 2 universities. I'd read all the statistics and spent time in very poor neighborhoods and talked to union reps and community organizers, and I just still felt like I didn't have that question answered. So in a way, this book is a book that I wish existed for me, and it's my answer to these 2 questions that were driving me crazy. Why is there so much poverty in this land of abundance, and how can we finally put it into it?
Okay. And before we're going to get into the book, but before we do, I want to ask just a follow-up, a sort of personal follow-up. Evicted was, widely lauded. It is, in my mind, one of the best nonfiction books, right up there with Random Families and The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. It's just such an amazing book. Was it scary to sit down at your desk and decide I'm going to write a second book to follow up?
No. I think that what was challenging was trying to write in a different kind of register. I feel pretty comfortable writing about like things I saw. Like, here's a scene I saw, let me try to bring you into the scene. And I feel pretty comfortable trying to translate like technical stuff to a broad audience. But this book required a kind of moral register that I really need my community to pull out of me sometimes. Folks that I'm writing in community with, my editors and my colleagues, to really push me down that. I think that was a voice I really needed to try to cultivate in this book.
Yeah, it's a very different book, and I think you've succeeded in cultivating that voice. It's great. So let's get into the book. The United States is a wealthy country, and it is really difficult to reconcile extreme inequality. We see it every day. It surrounds us. You're walking through DC, you see homelessness, encampments, and that's an extreme version. There's lots of poverty we don't see every day, but we read about. Why is there so much poverty in America?
Because many of us benefit from it. Some lives are made small so others may grow. And many of us on the left and the right and in the center, we've been pretty comfortable with absolving theories of the problem, as if there's all these tens of millions of people that don't have enough to make basic necessities, and it's nobody's fault. And I think that I've grown quite wary of those absolving theories of poverty. Many of us consume the cheap goods and services the working poor produce. Many of us are invested in the stock market, and don't we benefit when our savings go up and up, even when that comes at the cost of a human sacrifice? We have a welfare state that's incredibly imbalanced. We do a lot more to subsidize affluence than to fight poverty. And many of us like those tax breaks. Many of us benefit from those tax breaks. And then the country continues to be segregationist. We build walls around our community and concentrate affluence behind those walls, and that leads to a concentration of poverty too. And so I think that there's so much poverty in America, not in spite of our wealth, but because of it, which means many of us are connected to the problem and the solution.
So let's talk a little bit. That is I think the central thesis of the book, the theory of change, which is that we're all accountable and complicit in poverty as it is. And you ask us, you try to hold us accountable in the book, and you ask us to take a poverty audit of our lives, look at the decisions that all of us make on the day-to-day and how those might affect poverty. What are some of the changes that we can make? What are some of the things that you suggest in the book?
So we can shop and invest differently with an eye towards living in solidarity with the poor. Many of us know the kind of shoes to wear and the kind of coffee to drink to signal a political affiliation without really asking if that matters for the workers themselves that make the coffee or the shoes. Many of us know where our cucumbers come from. It's a local organic cucumber, without asking how much the farmhand got picking it. And so I think consulting organizations like B Corps or Union Plus can give us some guidance on that. I think those of us that are benefiting from the lopsided welfare state could really start taking a hard look at our own tax breaks and start having different conversations with our neighbors and our coworkers and our family members about those tax breaks. We just paid our taxes, and most of us who paid our taxes, we were like, crap, I gotta pay my taxes. And that's just how we talk about taxes. Taxes should hurt, Reagan famously said, and they do hurt. But what if next time tax season rolled along and your neighbor leaned over the fence and was like, dude, did you see the property bill this year? What if you responded by being like, dude, I can't believe I get a mortgage deduction for my home. And I don't need this thing. And I wouldn't have a problem with it if there wasn't like this eviction crisis and kids weren't getting evicted every day in this country. So I'm donating my deduction to local eviction defense, and I'm going to write my congressperson saying that they should wind this down for families like me. Now, that would be a different conversation across the fence line, but I think that's kind of how we change the common sense. And then, we have to turn away from segregation. We have to finally embrace broad, inclusive communities, which is not an abstract call. It's often a call for us to haul our tails down to a zoning board meeting at 10 o'clock or 8 o'clock on a Tuesday evening and stand up and be like, look, I'm not going to deny other kids opportunities my kids get living here.
Yeah. I mean, so that kind of speaks to one of the concepts you talk about in the book, opportunity hoarding. And I'm a parent of a 5th grader in public school, in a Title I school, and I see opportunity hoarding all the time. And I find it a really big struggle to figure out how to eradicate it. Like, having those conversations are really difficult, and I'm not sure if I have the tools to persuade people. What would you say to someone like me who, thinks about these issues, feels the complicity, but also feels like it is like intractable to change people's minds?
So I think a few things on this. A lot of us, like in this room in particular, we respond to a question like that by being like, well, the data actually, like Rucker Johnson's study shows that you can, and I'm one of you. I like data a lot too, but there's this other data that we kind of ignore sometimes in the policy world, which is it's social psychology data that shows that it's easier to change norms than beliefs, right? So it's easier to be like, dude, we're just not doing that anymore, than to be like, actually, and so, and we see this in climate movement, right? Many of us care about climate change, we believe in it, but we don't act on it until like we're driving down our street and we're like, did Cheryl put solar panels? Cheryl put solar panels on. Maybe we should get solar panels. Like, that stuff can be contagious. And so I think that part of this is trying to actually make that kind of opportunity hoarding uncool. And I'm not being glib about that. I actually think it's a strategy for us. And there's a ton of social psych literature that's, like when you go to hotels and there's like a little sign on the mirror and it's like, people like you hang up their towels. And you're like, well, I should hang up my towel, And I think that the more we can make it uncool bit by bit, the more we could try to change those norms. I think this starts with us, though. And a lot of times this question, it's like, man, that guy that's just like a little richer than me, I wish he did his part. Or like the guy that's a little more right of center than me, I wish they did their part. And I think that if we did more of our part, we could bring a lot more folks into the tent.
So you're saying be the change you want to be in the world?
I guess I'm a bumper sticker.
I think
I'm a bumper sticker.
I think that's excellent advice. I mean, I do think it works. I think you demonstrating in your actions, people follow, or and sometimes they don't. And maybe, the New Yorker, in a review of your book, wrote that the book's force is a gut punch. So what do you say to the people who don't feel the moral weight of your argument and demonstration doesn't work? What do you do then?
I think if we got enough that do feel it to actually move, that would be quite enough. I mean, one thing the book is trying to do is get us to be a little less satisfied by our level of activity on this issue. So if you look at zoning, right, in the abstract, Democrats are more likely to support like public housing in the abstract, but they are no more likely than Republicans to support an affordable housing development in their own neighborhoods. Studies show that conservative renters are more likely to vote yes on multifamily property in their community than liberal homeowners. So maybe we're not so polarized after all, And so I think that, I think that there's part of me that's like, if we just started more aggressively, energetically, and unblushingly attacking this issue and demanding the end of poverty in this land of dollars, I think that would matter a lot. I also think that there's a lot more consensus here than we often think, like on issues of basic economic justice, right? So the statistics show that most Americans believe that poverty now is the result of structural failing, not individual moral failing. Most Republicans and Democrats believe that. Most Republicans and Democrats want a higher minimum wage, which hasn't been raised in 13 years. Most Democrats and Republicans think the rich aren't paying their fair share of taxes, and they're right. And so there's a little story in the book that I love that comes from our friends at One Fair Wage, and they were doing this protest in Albany, New York. A bunch of African-American and Latino women from the service sector protesting in Albany, and it was the same day like there was a Stop the Steal rally, right? And so a lot of white guys in red hats came over, they're like, what are you guys doing? What are you protesting? And they're like, we are fighting for higher wages. And the MAGA guys were like, we want higher wages too. And they shook hands and joined their protest. Now, this isn't to dismiss our real differences, but I think on these issues, on the issues of like basic economic justice and fairness, I think there's a lot of Americans that want an end to poverty.
So those statistics are reassuring. I'm going to need to make sure I highlight those in the book. One of the things I did highlight in the book as I was reading it is just your collation of the statistics on tax evasion. And I would love for you to tell the audience a little bit about, because I think often the next thing is, how do we pay for this? How do we do, even though we are, the wealthiest country in the world, there is still this idea of we can't pay for it. So could you talk a little bit about some of those very persuasive data that you put together?
Sure. So a study came out a few years ago that showed that if the top 1% of Americans just paid the taxes they owed, not got taxed at a higher rate, just stopped evading taxes so successfully, that we as a nation could raise an additional $175 billion a year. $175 billion a year is more than enough money to reinstate the child tax credit that decreased child poverty by 46% during COVID. $175 billion a year, you could double our investment in affordable housing and still have money left over. $175 billion a year is almost enough to pull everyone below the official poverty line above it. And this is just the top 1%, and it's just about tax evasion, not avoidance or any of those shenanigans. And so I think that we have to reject this lie of scarcity. We have to cultivate a new language and stop repeating and accepting this kind of fabricated scarcity, and stop using our grown-up voice to say, well, like, in a land of scarce resources, that's not this land, actually. And so we're kind of acting like the farmer who has like a mean dog that crawls on like a pile of hay. And then so when the cows come to eat the hay, the dog growls at the cows, and so the farmer reduces their rations. And he kind of snatches hay from the side of the pile and feeds the cows like with what little he can do. That's kind of what the poverty research industrial complex is. But we should just move the dog. And so I think that this is a major part of the new work we need to do, I think.
So you are asking us to make different consumer choices, to make different decisions every day in our lives about where we live, how we show up in the world. But you're also asking to build a movement in a lot of ways that I hope that the theory of change is all of those actions add up to building a movement. And at some point, we are demanding something of our policymakers, right? So let's shift to solutions. We talked about money, but what are if you had to give one success story, because I think a lot of times people see poverty or homelessness as an intractable problem. It's like always going to be with us, something that we just have to live with. That's the way it is because we don't know how to solve it. So what success stories would you give, or a success story in the policy world would you give to that person who's sitting on the plane next to you that says, oh, we'll never solve that problem?
Well, COVID was a big success story, right? So the child tax credit, basically we had a guaranteed basic income for moderate and low-income families that cut child poverty by 46% in 6 months. 6 months. The emergency rental assistance in COVID was a huge success story. So we worked with Treasury and White House on that weekly in the Eviction Lab. And, we saw the government basically double HUD's budget and get that money directly to renting families. It reached over 10 million families, reduced eviction rates to the lowest they've ever been on record, ever. And so there are people that, will repeat cliches about poverty, about that the poor will always be with us or it's intractable. But I think there's another problem that those of us maybe in this room need to face up to, that we are really good at the language of critique, fluent in that language, and pretty bumbling sometimes in the language of repair or promise. We need to clear our throats and celebrate. There was a lot of people talking a lot of stuff when the ERA was like stumbling and not getting out the door, and everyone was tweeting about it and writing about it, and then when it hit families and it started working, no one said anything. And I think we need to cultivate that language if we want to win over that guy on the plane. I want to mention one of the success stories, because I think it's important for the work we can do, which is the Great Society and the War on Poverty. The reason those programs, one of the reasons that those deep investments in the poorest Americans worked so well was because they weren't fighting poverty alone. The job market was really delivering for American workers during that time. 1 in 3 workers were in a union during the war on poverty. Real wages were increasing by 2% a year. You had a good job. You could increase your, in the company, you had some benefits. But as we've moved away from that moment, as workers have lost power and jobs have got a lot worse, it's like our anti-poverty programs have to do a lot more work just to triage the pain. And I think for us, it's a learning lesson. It means that we don't just need deeper anti-poverty investments, we need different ones, including ones that attack exploitation in the labor and housing markets.
If you had a magic wand and you were waving it around markets, what would you change? Would it be unions? What would you change in the market, either the labor market or the housing market?
I think that for me, it comes down to expanding people's choices. So they have more choice and power about where to work, how to live, and how to get access to capital. So I would immediately end the financial exploitation of the poor by regulating overdraft fees on banks, which account for about $11 billion a year. That money is basically pulled from the pockets of 9% of bank clients, where the poor made to pay for their poverty. Again, just sidebar, who benefits from that? We do, because our free checking accounts aren't free, actually. And so I would do that. I would make sure that poor families don't just have this one best bad option, which is to rent from a private landlord and fork over most of their money to rent and utilities. And that's a lot of different things, because what works in DC is probably not what rural Alabama needs. So you could think of building out more social housing, investing in co-ops, making on-ramps for first-time home ownership. I like all those things at once, depending on the markets. And I think giving workers a seat at the table. And this means making organizing easy, investing in things like sectoral bargaining, so we can organize all of those warehouses or all those baristas at once, and doing things like worker representation at corporate boards. One of the big conversations we're having right now is AI, and that's going to happen to market. And one thing I'm shocked by about this conversation is where are the workers at the table? Where's democracy in this? Are workers going to get to say anything about something that might drastically impact their lives? I think we should design programs to give them voice.
Right. And you talk a little bit about policies and also things that we can do in the market. Where does racial justice fit into this?
It's central. It's impossible to write a book called Poverty by America without also writing a book about racism in America. One of the big stories here is how racism has so successfully divided low-income communities from one another. A big story about the labor and the loss of worker power isn't just an attack by political adversaries and isn't just about the economy changing away from manufacturing. It's also about the fact that old labor was racist, and blocked a lot of black and non-white workers from their ranks, shot themselves in the foot, and didn't allow for a full, robust, multiracial labor movement to emerge. Or when you talk about segregation, what you're talking about there often is racial segregation, right? Many poor whites are much more economically integrated at the community level than poor black families are. And so I think this is really just central to the work we do, which is a poverty abolitionist movement, has a lot of solidarity with the anti-racist movement.
So that brings to mind the concept of targeted universalism. Can you talk a little bit about that and explain that? I think that's a really one of the concepts that you talk about in the book that's really interesting.
Targeted universalism is an idea that comes from John A. Powell, the legal scholar at the University of Berkeley, and it's kind of a simple idea to communicate, but I think it has some pretty profound implications. And so Powell is like, okay, look, there's targeted programs like food stamps. They're very efficient, they work, but they're divisive, because if you make $1 over that cutoff, you're like out of the game, right? And that causes a lot of just infighting in a way between families that are below that cutoff and families right above it that are still struggling. And then you got universal programs which reach everybody but are not efficient, that are super expensive sometimes. And so he's like, why don't we split the baby by looking at this idea called targeted universalism? And it's like, instead of going through the means, let's look at the ends. What do we want? What's our goal? And maybe our goal is everybody in America should have a safe and decent place to live. That's our goal. Okay, what's safe and decent? We can define that. Like safe, and affordable, maybe it's 30%, 40%, whatever we kind of decide as a country. So there's going to be a lot of different roads to that goal, depending on your family circumstances, where you live in the country, your income, all that kind of stuff. And so targeted universalism is just to recognize that one size doesn't fit all, that let's talk about the ends and imagine the goal, and then let's find all these different means to kind of reach it. So I think that's kind of a new way of thinking about policy design in a way that kind of gets through these kind of other polarized, bifurcated debates that we usually accept.
Yeah, that was very interesting. I want to shift gears. There's a ton of people in this room who work around DC. There's a lot of people on Zoom as well who work in organizations that are working to end poverty. And I want us to shift the conversation a little to what we can do in our work every day and how we can be more effective. I'm going to invite my colleague Myra to the stage. This may be a chance for you also to, as I introduce Myra, to have some water, Matt. So Myra Jones-Taylor leads the Urban Institute's Policy Impact Strategy as the organization's first policy impact officer. She works with researchers and policy experts across Urban to help maximize the impact of their findings and evidence-based recommendations, while helping tell the story of how their work changes lives and strengthens communities. So before this role, Myra was the Chief Policy Officer at 0 to 3, where she led the development and implementation of the organization's policy agenda. She previously served as Connecticut's founding commissioner of early childhood, leading the cabinet-level state agency that serves children from birth to 5. And during her time as commissioner, she expanded access to high-quality preschool for 25% more 3- and 4-year-olds. She is a New America National Fellow, and she writes and speaks about racial identity, systemic racism, and social inequality. And she has a joint doctorate in American Studies and Anthropology from Yale. So welcome, Myra.
Thank you.
Myra is a new colleague. I'm super excited to have her here at the Urban Institute because I really care about I think we all do. I can speak for all of us at Urban. We really care about the impact of our work. And so tell us about your new role at Urban, Myra.
Yeah. Well, first, it is such an honor to share stage with you. Evicted, as I told you earlier, is really the book I think all ethnographers aspire to write, and Poverty by America is the book we need today. So it's a joy and an honor. Yeah, so I have a cool job at Urban. My job is to make sure that all the incredible evidence and solutions that we develop here across many issue areas and many different modalities and ways of doing the work have impact. I think a lot of people think about impact as the way you do it is maybe through the number of retweets or the number of citations you have in a peer-reviewed journal, relationships on the Hill, media hits. At Urban, we actually believe that impact is when people are better off, that it's measurable, that people in communities feel it, they experience it, it's tangible, their lives are different, they are better off. It's hard to do that when we're a little far removed, and so what my team and I are working with across our colleagues, across the organization, is to be a little more strategic about how we get our work into the hands of people who can we call change makers, who can really make sure that impact happens. I think a lot of the times there's a kind of a field of dreams approach to getting research out. It's if they build it, they will come. If we disseminate it, they will read it. Those of us know that doesn't always work. So how do we think about how we're engaging those people who are on the front lines, the decision makers, people in community who are most affected by this work? How are we thinking about engaging them so that our work is more impactful?
That's great.
Yeah.
We are so lucky to have you here. I want to talk a little bit about the role of evidence in advocating for change. And Matt, I'm going to ask you to put your hat on as the leader of the Eviction Lab. I know you have a great team there, and I wonder if you could share some lessons from your experience leading that lab around how evidence has made a difference, and also what the limitations of evidence are.
So we launched the Eviction Lab in 2018, I believe, because I wrote a book on eviction, and then I'd go around to like Houston and Baton Rouge and LA, and people would be like, "Well, what's our eviction rate? Like, is Milwaukee weird? Like, what's going on?" We had no national data on this, which is insane. Like, imagine if we didn't know how many like Americans like got in a car accident every year or got cancer every year. Like, that was our state of the knowledge. So if you were living in a community that was impacted by this, you knew it was real, but a lot of the American public just didn't have a number to get their hands around it. So we collected all the eviction records we could from all 50 states. It was important for us to get all 50 states. A lot of the places that have the best data are also the places that have like the most active like political organizations, and like we really cared about the Albuquerques and the Tulsas and the Richmond, Virginias of the world in a way. And we cultivated that data set, and we published it. Now, we published it before we did anything with it. We didn't publish any studies first. We didn't hold on to it. We saw it as a public good. So I think that was one of our first lessons. Like, get the data out as best you can, as soon as you can. And then we also invested really deeply in our website. We wanted tools that like an 8-year-old could use, basically. And so we did a lot of investing and working with web teams to design a website that was really nimble and intuitive, and like just with a few clicks you could get all this information. You could see evictions in your neighborhood. You can compare your city with other cities. And I think that really paid off too. More than 1 million people have been to our website now, which is pretty good for an academic nerd website that has data. And we've generated over 2,500 news stories. And I think one of the final lessons is like, build it, curate it, answer your phone when people call, and then get out of the way, actually get out of the way. And so getting out of the way is a hard thing for academics to do, because we want like all these clauses in our sentences and all this, like, but I think that we were just like, here's your evictions, and some journalists got it wrong. But like, I lost no sleep over wrongly reported stories. So I was like, here's another story about eviction. And like, we went for like 0 to lot. And so I think that getting out of the way allowed journalists and community organizers to tell their own stories instead of like citing a study. And I think that really mattered, actually. I think some limitations are the data can be really, the data are often flawed and messy. And so we did a lot of listening to community organizers, where we'd have data and they'd call us up and like, look, your data, your eviction rate for Louisiana is way too low. Like, this is what we're seeing. And so like listening to them and be like, how can we address this? How can we fix this? So a lot of ground truthing was really, ground truthing is like a lot of what the Eviction Lab does every day. And so I think that listening to organizers on the ground is really powerful. And also data give you like, I'm sorry, I'm being long-winded here. I'm just my wrap up. One of the things that data control the kinds of questions we can ask. And so there's a famous quote by Harold Coe, who taught at Yale Law, which goes, when you can't measure what's important, you make what's important what you can measure. And for poverty researchers, I think that's really important, because if you ask me, what's the data say about eviction? I would be like, well, someone's race really matters, gender, and kids. But like, people aren't evicting themselves. And so I think we need to build other kind of data sets about like power, ownership, exploitation. Like, for the past 60 years, the poverty data industrial complex has really built these massive data sets on the poor themselves. And it's really controlled the kinds of questions we ask around this. And I think we need to expand the aperture, and we're trying to do that at the lab now.
I think that's a really important insight. I think one of the things that we probably both learned during the pandemic is that there's practically no data on landlords.
Right.
And like we were sitting in the middle of the pandemic wondering if people were paying their rent, and we really had, at the beginning of the pandemic, very little information about that. And so we had eviction data from the lab, but not a lot of data on landlords, balance sheets, if people are paying the rent. So expanding the aperture is a really terrific insight. Myra, do you want to take a stab at that question? Sure. I feel like you talk to policymakers a lot, and that was, one of the things you did first when you came to Urban was talking to everyone in our ecosystem and really trying to understand how policymakers use data. What do you think is the role of evidence in social change?
Yeah, I mean, I think, if you think about today when truth is up for debate, when facts are relative to what you want to believe, right? It's hard to say, does evidence matter? Yes, it does. We are all doing important work. I think, one thing you said, Matt, is so relevant here is that actually data can get you so far. It's incredibly important to have. When I was a commissioner, for example, people would come to me and talk to me and try to advance certain things. I relied on data to fact check, to make sure what they're saying was relevant. I also used it to make the case when I was speaking before appropriations, right? So it's really important. But there's a limitation to it in that it only moves people so far. The numbers can only compel people so far, especially if there's, people aren't really all hip to paying attention to evidence in some ways. So what you said about how we engage people on the ground, I think is so critical. And that what I heard you say is it actually makes the evidence, it makes the research better. It makes it stronger when you understand the context. So that's one thing I would add. I was just tracking something on Twitter a couple days ago. A advocate in the housing space was responding, she was testifying, and she was responding to a question from the junior senator from Ohio. And he seemed skeptical about Housing Matters, or about Housing First, not Housing Matters, Housing First initiatives. And she very straightforwardly relied on the evidence. She leaned into it and explained why Housing First is actually far more effective than requiring somebody to get clean or have mental health support before they get housing, right? And I was so excited to see this. And then I thought, now a smart advocate is watching this and then thinking of all the people who are going to call his office and invite the junior senator to go speak with people who have actually benefited. So the data move, well, it's important to hear, but he is not going to be moved most likely unless he hears from his constituents. And so really savvy, strategic approaches to using evidence is pairing it with the people, different people who can be those trusted messengers.
I saw that clip too. I want to give a shout out to Diane Yuntal at the National Low Income Housing Coalition. Great clip and a really effective answer to a question that's been asked too many times.
Sure.
Well, you're hinting at storytelling. Let's talk about storytelling. I feel like when I think about storytellers, I think of you, Matt Desmond. I also, Myra, you're both ethnographer, done ethnography or ethnographers. Maybe you don't identify that way, but tell us about the role of storytelling in this in policy change. And maybe Matt, I'll start with you.
Well, I think that there is an importance of bearing witness and kind of taking a hard look at the stakes and making sure that abstract discussions really kind of come around a human form. Mm-hmm. And I think that there's this old lie in the academy that you have to have some distance from people to write about them rigorously and objectively, and distance is not our problem. We have plenty of that. I think you can fall in love with people and learn a lot from them and write about their lives in an honest way. But we also have to write different stories now, I'm convinced. I ran across this line by Tommy Orange, the novelist, where he writes, it's like these kids are jumping out of the burning, windows of burning buildings, falling to their deaths, and we think that the problem is that they're jumping. And when I read that, I felt so convicted. I was like, man, that sounds like the poverty debate. And so I think we need to find a way to tell stories about who lit that fire and who's warming their hands by it. And so I think that changes the way we do journalism and do policy work and do scholarship in a way that means telling different kind of stories about this issue.
And Myra?
Yeah, so I do identify as an ethnographer still, maybe former, but that was my training. My PhD is in anthropology, and I actually took my work. So I was an anthropologist, did all this work in New Haven, in the field, looking at childcare providers, and then completely was not planning on doing this. I went into policy, overseeing this exact set of policies. And the women I spoke with, they were almost all women, were very skeptical about a lot of the policy changes that was happening. And then I become the person in charge of implementing these policies because they were already in the books and I already had to do it. But I brought those stories with me. And we actually pushed back quite a bit on some policies that I knew were racist, that were inherently going to be problematic for people of color in particular. And we slow rolled a lot of those. Fast forward 20 years later, the same policies that we slow rolled and many other states had implemented, now people are backtracking against them and also saying they're racist. So I like to say we were ahead of the game. I say all this to say, one, sociologists, anthropologists out there, go into policy. It's really important. If you're doing ethnography, you are connected to the problems in ways that folks who go and get their MPA may not have that same kind of connection. So that's a plug for ethnographers. But I also think there's a real opportunity and understanding what it takes, what you did in your book. I mean, to really understand the full picture. I'm sure it was hard for you to sit and be in those evictions and stand there, but you were able to tell a story that I would have never understood without you doing that. So thank you for that. But I think there's a real opportunity to think about our proximity. And you think about the idea of being proximate to the problem, of course, Brian Stevenson and his work. So I think there's a real push to do that more. We are absolutely a little too distant from this work.
I want to underline something that you just said in that answer, Matt, I think you said this too in terms of the quote about distance, but I asked a question about how is storytelling effective, and I sort of came that frame, but in part of your answer, what you're also saying is listening is really important, and that without talking to people, without making sure that we're doing the work on the ground, that you really don't understand people's experiences. And so I just want to highlight that because I think that's important, something that we often overlook. And it kind of leads me into the next question that I have, which is, how do we tell people's stories? And Matt, I'll start with you. But how do we tell people's stories without exploiting them? When is it time to tell people's stories or stand aside? And if we're telling people's stories, what advice, as a storyteller yourself, what advice would you give people? Because I think it's something, as a researcher, I've struggled with, that I think that we struggle here at Urban with, which is how do you really tell people's stories and also make sure that it isn't exploitive, which is a big theme in your book.
Mm-hmm. I think we have to be accountable to those people in a real way, in a real genuine way. I remember writing a New York Times magazine story on a woman named Vanessa Sullivan. She was a single mom in Trenton, raising 3 kids, working as a home health aide, and it was a story about the working homeless. And I gave a book talk in Princeton a few weeks ago, and Vanessa came to the book talk. We're still in touch, and she's a very tall person, and so it was easier to see her in the audience. And so I gave a book talk, and the first question, this woman stood up and she said, "I volunteer in Trenton," which, if you're in Princeton, means something, I volunteer in Trenton. And we give a lot of these tutoring to these kids. And we should start tutoring the moms. We should start mentoring the single moms. What do you say about that? So I look out and I see Vanessa. And I'm like, I have to respond to this question in a way that holds me accountable to her, a single mom in Trenton. And I think that when I wrote Evicted, everyone saw that book before anyone else did, everyone in its pages. Journalists have a different kind of ethics on this, but in the academy, we can do this. And so I brought the book back, and I went over every single line with everyone that was in the book. And sometimes I read the book to them, and sometimes they read it while I was sitting across from them, and we talked about it. And I wanted to make sure that the book, they felt that it did them justice. And one of the most memorable moments was Crystal Mayberry, who's in the book. She asked me to read the book to her, not because she can't read, she just it was like a power move, like total Crystal thing to do. And so I read her story to her, and her story ends in a really dark place, right? She descends into street homelessness and has to turn to prostitution to make ends meet. And I stopped reading and I looked up at her, and she's like, yeah, there's some personal stuff in there, but that's how it was. It was such a brave thing to say. So I think being accountable to people and holding yourself, and I've also been in conversations like that where people told me to take things out of the book and I didn't, and it was like a debate, but it was like a conversation. So it's not just about it's not about bending, but it's also, I think, about being in real relationship. And then you get a platform, and then you can use that platform to bring in other stories. So the last time I was asked to testify in front of Congress, I was like, I'll testify, but you have to bring someone that's personally been evicted to testify too. And then, one of the things we do at the Eviction Lab that no one really knows about is we divert a lot of funding to the Economic Hardship Reporting Project, which funds stories about eviction and homelessness and poverty by journalists who have experienced those things themselves. And so I think that trying to leverage platform to expand the tint of expertise is really important too.
Have you, since Evicted, have you gone back and talked to folks that are featured in the book, and what is their reaction to sort of the visibility that it's gotten? Is there negative, positive?
Yeah, my first book event was with Arlene, who's kind of the main tenet that you follow in the book, and she came to the book event and sat next to my wife, and she was really just confused by why there were people in the room interested in her story. So there was kind of, at first, she was just like, why do these people care about me? And then she was kind of put off after a while because, there's this phrase, you put my shit on blast, you put my stuff out there, so we struggle with that together, and then she kind of, I would go and give a book talk and someone would ask, how's Arlene? And when that happened, I would text her or call her, but someone asked about you tonight, and that really meant a lot to her. And then when the book would do things in the world, move a bit of policy or something, I'd let folks know. And so I think Arlene, kind of saw her story as doing something really powerful in the world. And so she had this habit after a while of going to the public library and she'd go to a librarian and she'd be like, have you read this book, Evicted? And if the librarian was like, yeah, she's like, I'm Arlene. And it'd be like, what? It'd be this moment of...
Love it.
And so, it's not linear, right? It's not always easy conversations, but I think that creating something in the world that people ultimately can be proud of is really important to me.
Myra, tell us about, we talked a little about storytelling, we were talking about data. How about reaching policymakers? What is the most effective way to kind of cut through the noise and really make sure the evidence is getting in front of policymakers? I think some people think, I wrote a report. I used to say, if I wrote a report and it sits on a shelf, does that mean, no one reads it? Does that mean I wrote a report? And, the tree falling? And so constantly asking that question, tell us about what, ways that you think are effective ways to really make sure that data and those stories are getting to the right people who have the levers of change.
So one thing that I did when I first got here, you mentioned it, was not only talk to my colleagues internally at Urban, but also folks outside who use our work, rely on it. And there are quite a few. We do incredible work here. And one thing that a few people said, both in the administration, on the Hill, senior staffers, said, come talk to us and understand what's the nagging questions that we have. I think often what we do, and this is we broadly, the think tank research nonprofit world, right? I'm going to turn this way. There are quite a few of you over here.
I know, this side of the room feels so...
I know, folks over here too.
So I hope that's okay, camera. So we spend a lot of time just, we put this report out and we're going to go and talk to you and you are going to listen. And we're going to share all of our wisdom and it's going to be this incredible thing and you're going to do so much with this work, right? Yes, that sometimes does happen, but what will actually have people engage you more, I think, is if you actually, it's relational. You're understanding what they are really grappling with. So this one senior staffer said to me, come sit with us at a time when it's really quiet on the Hill and make this a regular practice of sitting down and asking us questions. And then what we will find is that Urban may already have that research. We may have it on the shelf. It's something we've done 10 years ago, we did it, and all of a sudden this is the policy window, right? Because we know sometimes it's not rapid response. This is work that takes a long time to develop. So sit with us and tell us if you have that research. And other times it's, whoa, we never knew that that was what you're grappling with. And so we can start to craft better research questions to answer that question. And funders love that, right? They want to know that we're being responsive, that we're engaging folks on the Hill. So I think that's one really important way. And this is my ethnographer, my training, but this is all about relationships. This is understanding that this is not a one-way street, that this is really change happens in the context of a broader ecosystem. And so much of that is about relationship. And then make sure it's good. I mean, like you said, you spend a lot of time on your website. Make sure that what you're doing, we have an incredible data visualization team here. Not everything needs to, requires a really fancy data viz investment, but sometimes that's going to be the thing that's really going to attract people. Sometimes it's picking up the phone and talking to folks, and there's a whole range in between.
Matt, do you want to add to that, how to more effectively reach policymakers besides be Matt Desmond?
Yeah, there's that.
Sorry, that's not fair.
Kind of like it's like hitting a nail with a hammer, and then like sometimes the nail goes in a little bit, but a lot of times it just doesn't.
Yeah.
And you just got to be okay with just like,
Yeah.
keeping it on the. I really think the focus on relationships is important, and like follow through and
Right.
follow up. I think that's, and I also think like we shouldn't be afraid to tell stories. I do think that. I do think if the book did anything on the Hill, it was because people connected to the people in the stories. And then the data kind of give this a broader context. But I do think that's an underutilized tool in our toolkit sometimes for those of us that do this work.
Yep.
I would add, I think often there's a transactional thing that happens on the Hill sometimes with fly-in days, where an advocacy group will have their folks come in and they'll meet with members, and then they get nothing out of it, right? The people who have been left their families to go testify, and it's so exciting, but that's it. And something that we did at my former organization, shout out to 0 to 3, we brought in, we had something called Strolling Funder, where every year we would bring in families from all 50 states to come meet with their members and talk about what they needed, paid leave, childcare, child tax credit, whatnot. But they didn't just get that time where they're coming in and meeting with us, meeting with members. We trained them. They got incredible skills on how to become advocates, and so many of those parents went off, left their jobs, and became professional advocates for their families, for their community. So I think, you talking about how you funnel funds to this journalism project for people who have experienced this themselves. Like, there are so many ways to share in the abundance of, that you talk about in your book.
That's a good point.
So my next question was about the scarcity mindset. We talked about that, we covered that. So I want to change it a little and talk about framing, because I think framing in a lot of ways, you talked about the scarcity mindset. We need to reframe that issue. How do you approach framing? I think a lot of times people write what their data says. Table 1 says this. And how do you think about framing? Is that something that comes naturally to you? Or is that something that you really think about? And do you have a process? Give us your secrets.
Okay. So I think that those of us that want to abolish policy need to start controlling the questions that get asked. And a lot of times in our work is kind of like this, like nuh-uh, actually nuh-uh, and someone else has already asked the question, and then we are responding to it.
Right.
And I think that we need to ask the question. And so, in the eviction research world, a question I'm fascinated with is who's doing all these evictions? Who owns the city and who's doing all the evictions? And when you go down that rabbit hole, you can get to a claim, in Tucson, we went down that rabbit hole and we learned that the top 100 evicting buildings evict 3/5 of the city. So then that's kind of it. Now we're kind of on a different, now I'm kind of controlling the question. Now you're who are those guys? Why are they doing, what should we do about those guys? That's kind of we are very far away now from like, why aren't people paying the rent? These kind of questions. And so I think that one of the big parts of framing is like, who gets to decide the question? And how can we start asking different questions that set a different conversation than the old one that's like driven the poverty debate for the last 100 years, basically. I think that's a big part of it. And I think being in touch with communities really matters because they have questions, and I think like a lot of times their questions are really fascinating and some of the best ones. So I think being in contact with a lot of different constituents on this work is important for the frame. I do think you also were asking a question about craft in there maybe a little bit too. And I do think that for me anyways, there's no political impact outside of craft. And I think we really do have to take the aesthetics and the beauty of what we do kind of seriously if we want to break through.
Do you have specific tips?
I
We have
think
a whole
that,
audience of people who are interested in that, I think. And Myra, I'm going to come to you on the question of framing.
I'm all ears for this answer.
Well, it will shock you to realize that the best writing usually isn't done in the policy world. And so I think like we're getting a palate cleanser, and finding writers that we feel have this like observational genius, like they can look at the world and cut through stuff. I think that's really important. In the policy world, like the old economists were great at this actually. Like the mid-century economists had this beautiful way of writing about these really complicated issues, but with clarity and conviction. So I think that finding that writing and connecting that, make it part of our daily practice really matters. And I also like, it's a lie that like authors write books. Like I write in community. And so, this last book went through these massive book workshops where writers like Kianga Yamada-Taylor and Tressie Cotton and Kathy Eden and Luke Schaefer and Jason DeParle and Sarah Silverman like read early drafts of the book and they just like gave it to me, and whole chapters were decimated because of that and whole chapters were written because of that. And so I think writing in a community of people that love you but also really to hold you accountable, including at the sentence level, I think really quite matters.
Myra, what advice would you give people about framing? About how to better frame up issues and present some of the data that we all talk about and write about?
Yeah, I think there's an interesting push right now and we do incredible work around community engaged methods where we really bring the voice of community in. And I think as an ethnographer, I am so happy to see that. And I also bristle a little bit, not by what's done here at Urban, really, truly. When people see that as I'm just going to take a story and plug it in, and that's going to be the lead, and then I'm just going to follow up with a lot of data, right? And then that's just like color. It's really, that is equal form of evidence that I think is really important. So framing conversations, framing stories with the lived experience of people who are whatever experience the issue that you're covering is really important. There's this amazing book, Influence is Your Superpower. I don't know if people on my team have heard me talk about this. It's a great book. You should read it.
I'm sorry.
Influence is Your Superpower.
Okay.
And she writes about how facts can only get you so far, and there's a whole way of engaging people that influence them, and this can be in any context. And she talks a lot about framing and how you tee up people to have the conversation to hear will actually change the way they hear if they can really hear what you're saying. And I'm going to come back to something you wrote in your book, which I think is so fascinating and really a major reframe of this issue, which is we are going to lose something. Those of us who have abundance are actually going to have to give something up, which is not the frame that we usually hear. And yet it feels so disingenuous when you're really putting it out there in a way that I appreciate, and it's hard. So all of these poverty abolitionists, which I love, which would be the hashtag maybe up there too, is about giving up something. And that's the moral charge that you give us in this book that I think I hope people really pick that up in this book. And it's a big reframe from the way we've talked about poverty. You also talk about, when we usually write about poverty, we write about the poor, and this is a different story too. So I just think it's important in this context, and then thinking about research institutions, really, why are we doing this? Are we doing this work because we think it's an interesting research question? And I think that's fine in some settings. But if we are in a research institution outside of academia, I think it's incumbent upon us to take it a step farther, and that we are really committed to actually seeing change. We want this work to have people end up being better off. And that's a reframe in many ways in the way we do our work in research institutions broadly.
That's a really, I mean, I think, Matt, you do talk about that point in the book, which is we are going to have to give something up. But you also, which I think is absolutely true, and I think it's good to admit that. But you also talk about Raj Chetty's inventor study. And in a lot of ways, we're losing something. Can you talk a little bit about what we're losing by not ending poverty?
I mean, for those of us that are struggling and are crushed and exhausted by poverty, the end of poverty is like a whole other existence, right? It's finally being able to breathe. It's safety. It's literally life. A lot of the research on what happens when you raise the minimum wage that's done by health researchers is like incredible. People stop smoking, more babies are born healthy. It's like we're literally stealing life from people. But for those of us that have found some security and some comforts in this country, the end of poverty is something that we all should pine for as well. That's a freer country. That's a safer country. That's a country where you don't have that ickiness that you feel when you kind of are participating in the systems and you know it. It's a country where you go out to eat and you sleep in a hotel and you know everyone's taken care of. That's a country where you don't have to worry about your kids all the time and like invest in this like social attainment machine because like that's the only game in town. And so there's this old book called The Book of Sands, and it has this line in it which says, if you want your people to build a ship, you don't gather the team and you don't assemble the wood, but you make them long for the edge of the sea. And I think that one of the challenges for us in this work isn't just to say, you should do this, the right thing to do, which I think has currency, but also like, isn't this the country you want to live in? Like, doesn't this thing drags us all down? And I think that's part of the narrative challenge too.
I'm going to move to audience questions. I have two more questions. Myra, this one's for you. Who are our most important partners in making change? And I'm going to come to you too, Matt.
I don't want to answer that. Can you answer?
I think it depends on well, I'll start by saying I think it's always the people who are most directly affected by whatever policy change, whatever we're talking about. They're the ones who know best about the actual experience of the conditions, and a lot of the solutions can be found by talking to people who have this experience. I would also say it depends, though, on which levers to pull or who to engage at which time. And so I talk about this internally here at Urban a lot about we are part of a change maker ecosystem, an impact ecosystem. And Urban, when we say change maker, we don't just mean decision makers on the Hill, we mean folks in community, we mean advocates, we mean funders, the whole range of people who are working to affect change in this country, positive change in this country. And so we think about that ecosystem, and we need to make sure that we are engaging all of them and that we're engaging them at different levels at different times when it makes sense. So it doesn't necessarily make sense to go to your state legislator and share all the data that we've shared, we've drummed up, unless the people on the ground, the advocates, are going to kind of be the wind at your back. And so there's a whole, I think, there's this whole strategy around how you engage people at what time, when, but it's all contingent on having relationships, existing relationships. It's not, it cannot be transactional because it won't stick. It won't kind of have the kind of heft. I don't know. You seem skeptical, so push back.
You want to add to that?
Oh no, I was just like, yeah, it sounds great.
Okay.
Yeah, that was my sitting. That sounds great face.
Oh,
yeah.
good. Oh, good. I like it. Okay, good.
Yeah.
I'll take
What
it.
does your skeptical face look like so we know?
It's like this. Yeah.
So last question from me, and then I'm going to turn to the audience, and I have this magic iPad where all of your questions are just popping up in here. But I want to start with Matt. Tell me how you measure the success of the Eviction Lab and your work there.
That's a great question. So, I mean, real metrics, like literally how many people are coming to the website, how many news stories have we generated, where in the country are we missing? So we know where we've gotten deep coverage, like the year after we launched, there were 60 stories in Virginia about eviction. Like we're getting through in Virginia.
Yeah.
You said a lot of bad things about Virginia and
Yeah, well,
eviction, which is great.
I mean, well, they passed this massive affordable housing bill while the governor was like circling the drain because of an old photo that came out of him in blackface in college. But even during this like crazy political moment, we still got a lot of stuff passed in that state legislature. So I think that one of our ends is like, here's a little metric of narrative change. There's just more out on it. And for those of us that have been in this game a little bit, I haven't been in the game for a long time, but I'm getting a little gray hair. And like when I wrote about Evicted, like Obama didn't talk about housing. Hillary had a housing platform, but she had a platform for like tying your shoes and everything, so it kind of didn't count. But she had a housing platform. But then, Biden said the word evictions in his first State of the Union. So I do think that the advocates and the researchers and the whole community focused on this have really pushed this issue to the top of the national agenda in a place it wasn't 10 years ago. We judge it by that. And then we judge policy impact, and we kind of say, we can kind of trace where we can see, we launched the eviction lab, we focused on these metrics, we got the attention of Virginia, we changed the law there, and we're focused on, when the eviction moratorium was launched and initiated, a lot of that movement cited our research to justify this historic move that dropped the death rate during COVID by 11%, according to a Duke study. So I think we kind of keep receipts there. And I also think we also keep receipts on the fact that who's using us and are we reaching different kind of constituents? Because we don't want to just be used by folks that have 2 PhDs in computer science at MIT. Like we want to be used by a lot of different folks. And I think that's one metric of our success, too.
Great. Myra, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you are in the fortunate position with the work at the Eviction Lab, and that you can actually take it a next step farther, and you can actually track, at least during COVID, the number of evictions, the number of people who are housed as a result. So you can do this incredible through line. And something we talk about here at Urban is, we are a research institution. So if I think about this, how impact happens, right? There's policy or population level change here. You can think it happens through narrative change, policy change, practice change, even legal change increasingly in this country. And there are a whole host of change makers that are making this happen, right, in this ecosystem. I just completely lost my train of thought. This is something I always talk about. Shoot, where was I going with this?
Through line impact.
Thank
it's
you.
Hard to get there.
Thank you, Matt. I appreciate it. I'm glad there's a test. But we are a few steps removed, right? We're not government. We're not a direct service provider. So it's hard to track that impact. And yet it is incumbent upon us to do that because we know we are having impact. We know that people are reading our research. And so one thing we're really excited to think about, love to think about with someone like you, is how do we track that? So you had 60 reports in Virginia, right? You can then track the policy change. What are those networks? Who are those people that were using that, who were reading that? How are they changing? How is that affecting the way they talk about eviction, the fact that they say it? How is that affecting the policies that are now being promoted in zoning law? So it's not just about evictions, right? It's also these walls that we talk about and we think about if we're talking about a broader housing push. So I think there are so many ways that we could be more creative, more sophisticated in how we're actually tracking this our work and our impact. And it is hard, and I want to be really clear, it's not the job necessarily of researchers, right? Like that's the job of these other folks like myself and my team and colleagues across the organization where we come in and we do some of that work and we provide that extra oomph to it. But it's so important so that we can really test what's more effective and what conditions and what is like, maybe we shouldn't be doing that again because it's, when I was in advocacy, there are times where this is during Build Back Better, and we would be sitting there and we were so close to getting childcare, we were so close to getting child tax credit, and then it all kind of crumbled, and it was a really devastating series of conversations. And there are times when we are in these calls throwing spaghetti on the wall. What should we do next? And sometimes that's what you have to do. This is not an exact science, But wouldn't it be great if we had a little bit more data to think about what is going to be effective and in which conditions and what we should be pulling on and maybe not trying or tracking in other times? So I know, that's your skeptical look.
So, I mean, one of the things, I mean, it just brought to mind this idea of where in the research community, I feel sometimes that when we're judging impact, we ask so much of a policy. You know, like there's studies like, does housing voucher increase labor market participation? And I'm like, that's not their job, actually.
That's right.
And, you know, does food stamps increase literacy rate? I don't know. Like, you know, it's like, so there's often, like, I think we also have to question, like, what's our level of, like, the ROI language? And how, you know, are we asked, you know, sometimes it's like we're dosing a project so little, it's like we're giving a cancer patient like 3 Tylenol and we're like, well, it doesn't help, you know, why? What's wrong with the Tylenol? It's like, nothing. It's just like, you have to dose this thing. And so I also think that it's like sometimes you have to do it just because it's the right thing to, like it's a human decency level. And the metrics of return are really hard to get your head around too.
I will just say in the early childhood space, which is where I come from, there was both a real advantage and a disservice. The return on investment language still continues to be used for advancing childcare. $1 for, you know, for every dollar spent in early childcare, $13 or $7.
Right.
But what it did was tunnel vision. Talk about the tunnel vision you talk about in your book. It narrowed the focus so that we're thinking about it in one way and we're missing the fuller context of why we invest in young children, because we pegged it to that one ROI. And that, getting back to your book, there is a moral reason behind all this, which is kind of hard for us, is hard data. And, you know, I won't put myself in the serious data wonk place. I feel like I'm a little removed. But what is our obligation? What is our moral obligation for this work? Why do we do this work, if not to see that people are better off? And I think that doesn't mean it changes the rigor of our research. It doesn't mean that we're, you know, teaching to the test, but it means that we're doing it with real conviction and that we maybe lean into it a little differently.
You get into, I was going to go to the audience, but I have one more follow-up question because that raises, I was taken by some of your language in your book, Matt, where you describe things as sinful. And that is not language that, you know, researchers, academics usually use. And I was, you know, I think that starting to think about, you know, where do we go, how do we go to that moral level, that moral weight? And I wonder where you look for that guidance, who writes really well on that? Do you feel comfortable in that space? You definitely start at it in the book.
Baldwin and Orwell, I think, have a real, you know, Baldwin writes with this beautiful righteous anger. I feel like no one does it quite like he does it. And Orwell also has this like ethnographic approach to this, where he's like, man, I saw this, and I can't believe we do this, you know. And I think that I'll pull whatever lever, you know. And I think there were times where I think that the moral language just came out of me in a way, and it felt, I try to make it earned. You don't want to rap on the chalkboard, you know, and you're hoping when you go to that register, the reader's like already there, and so they feel more like, of course, instead of, whoa, you know.
Yeah. Okay, we're going to go back to being a little wonkier. So this is a question from the audience. For many of us, we work in particular sectors, food justice, housing justice, on labor issues, or transportation. But we know all of these are intimately interrelated. How do you recommend building policy approaches that cut across areas? And I'll start with Matt.
Why?
I was going to do that, not it.
This is the luxury of having 2 people on stage.
I mean, this is tricky because our policymakers are also divided in the same way. And often, like, for me, like, if you go look at the 502 plan that the USDA does about homeownership in rural America, I'm like, well, why can't we do that like in urban America? And people are like, well, this is a USDA project, not a HUD project. And it's just like, what are we doing? So there's a part of it is like the siloing is often very, like just how the government works, and it kind of, there's a translation importance there. But it's also like, we're all focused on the same families, right? Those of us studying food insecurity and eviction and educational inequality are all studying the same families. And it points to how poverty is this correlated adversity, right? This tight net of social maladies. And I think that combining forces means that we could accentuate the moral power of the work in a way. Like this is, like poverty in America for a lot of Americans is really bad right now. It's really bad. And kind of describing that through kind of getting out of our silos maybe is one step that I would say.
And I was going to say, it's something that you do in the book, I think, and part of that is, I mean, you're a deep expert in the housing field, and then you do bring in a bunch of broader issues, and I'm thinking about a time during the pandemic when we're all thinking, how are people paying their rent? There's no housing assistance yet. And then it was like, duh, unemployment, there's unemployment insurance. And some of it is just talking to other people, like talking to the Urban Institute is made up of a lot of people who have expertise in different things, and we don't often talk to each other. And advocates don't often talk to each other. They kind of just dig their heels into that one issue. So Myra, you focused on children in your former job, and that is focusing on the person. Tell us if you have lessons about bringing all the different sectors together.
Yeah, so when I was commissioner, my charge was to focus on childcare, supports for children with disabilities, home visiting, but to your point, all of these children were showing up in different systems. They were showing up in our need for housing. They were showing up in our TANF cases. They were showing up in all of these different systems to say they were not doing well, and yet we weren't looking at them. We're looking at them in total isolation. And so being part of a governor's cabinet, I was able to talk to my counterparts in social services, talk to my counterparts across the agency or the state government to start thinking about how we could get young children inserted into their mandate. And so one example we did this was around homelessness, actually, where young children weren't showing up. There were no really any child advocates who were at the table. My agency really wasn't at the table until we started looking at and showing that babies are more likely to end up in homeless shelters than any other demographic. And the great thing about when you're working with babies is for some folks who are a little harder about adults, they will soften when it comes to kids. And so we're able to trade on this, sounds a little too tactical, but we were able to use this to widen the net of people who were engaged. So people who we knew were big baby champions or early childhood cared about young children, we were able to talk about the need for supportive housing, for broader family housing, because it was affecting young children. So I think there are strategies that we can use to think about what's the common denominator or what's going to move people. And young children often are way in, and often they can just be tokenized too. So you really have to be careful about that. I will say during the childcare pushes, there was a lot. I was also thinking, why are we not engaging the unions? Why were we not engaging SEIU? Why were we not engaging all these? And so to create a broader tent is a way to have more force. You have more people who are coming to the table. And so how do you show that commonality of these issues was really important and highly effective, I think, for bringing, especially some people who are less likely to care until we talked about young children.
So Matt, this question is for you. And I want to make sure people are walking away with actionable ideas about what they can do. And this person asks, what's a small thing I can do in my neighborhood to help reduce the impacts of poverty?
I think that you know your neighborhood better than I do. And I think that, taking a page out of like the gay rights struggle, like, well, where do you have influence? Like, what could you do in the thing you have influence? So I might not have influence at the University of Wisconsin. Maybe I can't, I'm an alum, so maybe I can leverage a little bit of influence. But like at Princeton, I could ask like, well, are we paying our landscapers okay? So I think that starting with your influence a little there as well, and be willing to have awkward conversations. I think that's how we're going to change. Now look, I don't think we're going to solve climate change by all drying our laundry. And I don't think we're going to solve poverty by all making these steps. But we all talk about this, and we're like, well, we know what to do, and we have the resources, the political will. So how do you build political will? This is how we do it, actually. These little small things. Like, I can't see a world where we get the Inflation Reduction Act, the most important thing Congress has ever done to fight climate change, without a lot of us being like, what am I eating? What am I driving? Do I need to take that flight? I think that build up a political will that forced lawmakers' hands. And so I think that this is a part of that. So I think thinking about how we shop and invest is a bit of a step. You could also join like local anti-poverty organizations. And if you're interested in getting connected, I built a website. It's called endpovertyusa.org. And you can find anti-poverty organizations all over the country putting in the work.
Myra, I'm going to start with you here. How could the grassroots or public movement fight against the corporations and lobbyists that drive so much of the agenda in Washington?
Oh boy, really?
I gave Matt some hard questions.
You did.
Too.
Yeah. Exactly.
I mean, thinking about your time, talking to policymakers on the Hill, how can we make sure the agenda is really what we want it to be and not what lobbyists want it to be that represent corporate interests?
Yeah, I was going to say lobbyists come in many forms. I had lobbyists who advocate for young children, so not
legislative. We call those legislative advocates.
Yeah. Well, no, they were paid lobbyists. There are lobbyists who actually do who lobby for good things, but they are not corporate lobbyists. They don't have the kind of resources that corporate lobbyists do. So that said, I think part of it is I think this sounds so trite, but there is power at the local level. Know your community, know your folks, start from there. Because that honestly is, that's what legislators want to hear. When I was in state government, they didn't want to hear from me as a commissioner. They didn't want to hear from, honestly, the Urban Institute at times. They wanted to hear from the person in Bridgeport who had this particular experience. So start to engage at your own kind of locus of control where you know best. And then I think it is having those tough conversations, showing up. I mean, I love you mentioned this a few times, the Tuesday at 8 o'clock meeting and showing up at your zoning meeting to push back. One of my dearest friends from college was doing this in LA where they're trying to increase affordable housing, and it was just not going well. And so I bought him a T-shirt that said NIMBY is a disease, because he was just, so he shows up in these meetings with this. But he goes to these meetings. So I think there is a way to start engaging and then look around. Come to the Urban Institute. I mean, I think what I really hope from this conversation is the people who are seeing themselves as poverty abolitionists will say, okay, I know I have a story, but I need some data. I need some of the evidence. Go to the eviction lab, go to endpovertyinamerica.org. I'm going to put in a little plug for you.
You'll get there.
Okay, good. We have incredible resources to help you kind of stand up when you're there to testify and know that it's your personal story and you're backed up with evidence, because I think they do a 1-2 punch. I feel like this feels so Pollyannish, but it really does it's these individual acts that just start to build on each other, and do your research, connect with folks.
So I think the audience has gotten a lot of good advice on the steps that they can take. I think that there's probably still some pessimism that's sort of evident in the question that I have in front of me around the theory of change. The person says, I'm deeply pessimistic about the willingness of white middle and upper middle class parents to embrace Matt's arguments. I'm surrounded by friends and colleagues who move to the suburbs so their kids can attend higher quality school or pay extremely high costs to send their kids to private schools. They may say that they're concerned about poverty, but they're not willing to risk opportunities for their privileged kids to help the poor. What will it take for people to actually take action? And you've answered this, I think, question a little bit. I don't know if you want to add to that answer, but I also want to ask you and add on to that, which is, what do you say to the pessimists to help turn them into optimists? So there's 2 questions there.
So I've been getting this question, and when I get a question a lot like this, I often think, what is that question doing? Not how to answer the question, but what's it doing? And I think that if we took this seriously, that would be enough. And I think that there's always going to be someone that's like that. And one of the things I hear in this question is a bit of hopelessness, And I get it. I get it. But I think that our hopelessness is useless. It's useless. And I think that if you look at the 1960s, it was pretty hopeless. The country was divided. Congress was a mess. Government obstructionism and inaction wasn't just the outcome, it was the goal. We were anti-democratic in fact, not just in threat. In fact, we were barring blacks from the voting booth. And in that situation, we got major pieces of civil rights legislation, and we got the modern social safety net in the Great Society and War on Poverty. And it got so much done, got done despite all those odds. It was because the civil rights and labor movements put unrelenting pressure on Congress, despite the lobbying pressure, despite the racists in Congress. And so I think that should give us hope. You know, we've been here before. We've been polarized and divided. There have been moneyed interest in our government since time immemorial, and still there have been moments of power. So part of this work, I feel, is just imagining a possibility of a better future. That's a discipline in and of itself. And so when I was listening that you talked so eloquently on corporate interest, I was reminded of, you know, when I started coming to this town and advocating for like deeper investments in housing affordability, and the pay for was like reforming the mortgage interest deduction, everyone in this town was like, that will never happen. It's impossible. The corporate interest won't do it. It's impossible. It's impossible. And then what? Trump just did it. Trump's like, reform. You know, like things that like liberal housing advocates have been asking for years or weren't touching because they thought it was a third rail. So things are like impossible till they're suddenly not. And I think that's a big lesson we could learn from folks on the ground too.
I think that's where we're in. Things are possible. Things are impossible until they're suddenly not. So thank you. Thank you both for being here. Myra, thanks for being a terrific colleague and for being here at Urban, helping us think about these issues on impact. And Matt, thank you for writing another wonderful book.
Thanks for having me.
Matt can be here until about 2 o'clock. We have a table set up, so if you have books that you'd like signed, Matt is generously going to be around to sign some books. And so I want to ask you all to put your hands together and thank Matt and Myra. Thank you.